Hi everyone, in this video I want to dive into continuous access evaluation, a feature that's getting a lot more attention when we think about handling those access tokens and how long they live and how I can revoke if there's been some kind of problem. Now, historically, if we think back to tokens, we have some resource that we want to talk to. So I can think about, well, I'm here as some client, and I want to leverage some resource. So we'll have the idea of we have a resource. This could be Exchange Online, Teams. We'll go into some details about that. But I have some resource that I want to talk to. And then this resource trusts Entra ID for the authentication. So we have our Entra specific tenant up here. So we have Entra. And if I want to talk to this resource, what's happened is I have authenticated to Entra. Now, when I did that authentication, what happened is I got a refresh token. So I've got a refresh token sitting in my computer right now. And what I want is to get an access token for this particular resource. So what happens here is I send my refresh token to Entra with a request. It's like, hey, I would like an access token for this resource. So I send my refresh token with the request. Entra at this point would look at the conditional access policies that relate to this particular resource. And if I satisfy those requirements, well, it would go and create me an access token for this resource, and it would send me that access token. And now, fantastic, I have the access token. I would now go and send that access token to the resource. I've been authorized to use it, and then fantastic, I'm on my way. The challenge with this is the resource trusts this access token because it trusts and uses Entra and it's been signed accordingly, but there's no communication between the resource and Entra. So if something happens, I have no way of revoking, ordinarily, that access token. It's super powerful. I can't take it away. And it's because of this, because there is no revocation list that Entra puts out that the resource can go and check, because there is no online status service like we have with certificates, this access token has a short lifetime by default. Normally it's 1 hour. And so the idea here is, well, if it's just 1 hour, if something does happen, they've only got access for an hour. If the token got stolen, they've got access for an hour. If the person leaves, well, they've got access for 1 hour. Because every hour they have to go back and request a new access token with their refresh token, and they get a new refresh token back as well. But it's that very short-lived. Now, work is being done around token binding, which gives me protection for those scenarios I'm talking about. Hey, if tokens are stolen and people are trying to reuse them. And I did a whole video on that, but that is not everywhere today. So how can I think about 1 hour is too long? How can I think about, well, I want to be able to revoke that access token that historically has not been possible? Now, obviously here, the answer is going to be continuous access evaluation. And what's happening with continuous access evaluation is we introduce the idea of some endpoint that is available now through Entra. So if I think about the idea that now, endpoint is the wrong term, but just think about the idea that, hey, there is something that what happens here is when there are certain types of event, those events get written and are accessible from this endpoint. Now, when we're talking about events, it's something that would be a critical event about the user. The user has been deleted, the user has been disabled, the password for the user has been changed or reset. MFA has been enabled for the user. I explicitly revoke the tokens for the user. Or maybe high risk has been detected via Entra ID protection. And we can look at the documentation. And the documentation goes through exactly what those things are. So any of these are considered critical events. And in this scenario, these would now be made available via that endpoint. Now, additionally, there's only certain services supported for this. So if I think about, okay, well, there are these critical type events related to the user that will trigger, hey, I need to do a revocation. But also when we talk about these resources, today it is only Microsoft first party. And specifically when we think about that, it's Exchange, it's SharePoint Online, and also that means OneDrive, it's Teams, and it's also the Microsoft Graph. Now, expect this list to grow over time. This is where they are today. But yeah, it's only those first party and it's only those services. The other important thing here is the client itself. This has to be continuous access evaluation capable. And that will make a lot more sense in a second. Now, anyone can write a client that is CAE capable. Obviously, the Microsoft clients for things like Windows and iOS and Android. But for example, the iOS native mail app is also CAE enabled because it has to be able to respond to certain challenges that are going to happen when this CAE actually happens. Now, if I'm curious about, well, when I'm talking to a certain one of these resources through the combination of my client and the resource I'm talking about, has continuous access evaluation been enabled? And if we jump over for a second, if I go and look at a sign-in, so right now I'm looking at Diana, and what I can see here is you have this continuous access evaluation has been set to yes. So in this case, it will respond to those types of revocation events that could happen. So that's what I'll be looking for. So I'm just going to go and look at the sign-in logs for a particular identity. And in this case, it's a non-interactive sign-in because I've grabbed a token for something else. And I can see that, yes, this is for CAE. Now, what I'm actually doing in the background is every 15 seconds, I'm pinging the me graph endpoint. And you can see I'm getting a status of 200 OK, and it's just displaying my display name. Because what I want to try and show, hopefully, if the demo gods are on my side, is a revocation and what actually gets seen. So those are the things we need in place. So when I have continuous access evaluation, which is just part of Entra, there's nothing I have to do for these Microsoft first-party services, and providing my client is CAE capable, it's now going to be able to respond quicker than waiting for the token to expire after an hour if one of these critical events actually happens. Now, specifically, when one of those critical events happens, it generates a revocation event. So over here, I'll write it out so we get a revocation event. And what's happening now is this particular resource, because it's aware, it has a connection to whatever that endpoint is to look for those revocation events. And when that revocation happens, if we read the documentation, what it says is it is a 15-minute revocation SLA. So with the SLA states within 15 minutes of that revocation event happening, it should no longer accept that access token. Now, in my experience, I've never seen it take that long. I've been doing a lot of playing around with this. A few minutes is the typical thing that's going to happen. Now, for fun, we saw I had my little script running over here, and it's just every 15 seconds looking to see, hey, can I connect? So it already has an access token for Graph. Now, what we're going to do is if we just jump back to the overview of this user, we are going to be mean. We're going to revoke all of the sessions for Diana. So do you want to revoke all sessions for the user? Yes. So that is now successfully revoked all of the sign-in sessions. Now, if we look straight away, this is going to carry on being fine. This is not going to instantly fall apart. So what's happening now? So what happens now is a revocation event is being written to the endpoint within some period of time. Now, obviously, if I was using something like user sign-in risk, well, that uses offline signals. This is 15 minutes from the time the revocation event gets created. But user sign-in risk is not real time. It's using offline, so that would take longer. But in this case, me revoking the sessions, well, that should be very fast, and I would definitely expect it within the 15 minutes. So once the service sees that revocation event, what it's now going to say is, hey, this access token is no longer any good. And it will generate a response to the client. It doesn't just refuse it, because that would be very unhelpful. What it's going to do is send a 401. So it's going to send a 401 response, and it's going to include a claims challenge. So imagine, for example, hey, my account was disabled. It's going to have some challenge to say, hey, you need to go and send me a new token after this time to show you've been enabled again. Or, hey, if it now needs MFA, I need a token with MFA. So it's sending a challenge that the client now has to satisfy to prove the client can still go and talk to Entra. And this is why it has to be CAE capable, because it has to be able to handle the 401. It has to know what to do. So if it wasn't CAE capable, it would get this and then go, well, I don't know, it would just try and resend the old token again and fail miserably. Because it's CAE capable, it gets this with the challenge in it. And what it will now do is it will send a request again to Entra, say, hey, I need an access token. So it would send the refresh token and say, hey, I need an access token. But it would say, here's the challenge I was given, and Entra will now create a new access token that includes the response to the challenge, give it to the client, and the client could now send it and would have access to the service again. So that's really the big deal about the client has to be CAE capable as well, because in the header of this message, there'll be a www authenticate, and in there is the challenge that the client has to know, say, oh, I need to take that challenge and send it to the token service in Entra. Now, if we go and look, it's been a couple of minutes. Okay, so it's not kicked in yet, so we can see it's still sort of trawling through the thing. We'll come back and check. Again, the SLA is technically 15 minutes, so it can take that long. But right now, it's not kicked me off quite yet. Now, one of the upsides of this is, do you remember I said, well, the tokens were 1 hour. They're short-lived because there was no way to revoke them. Well, because now they can be revoked, the tokens become long-lived. So these tokens I get because it's CAE capable. And what happens with this CAE capable, every time the client goes and asks for a token, it's telling it, hey, I want a token, please. And by the way, I am CAE capable. Every single thing it ever asked was like, I can do CAE. I can do CAE. And so Entra knowing that, and if it's for an CAE capable service, so it knows it can use CAE, instead of this token being 1 hour, the token will actually be between 24 and 28 hours. It varies slightly, but the token is now long-lived. So what that does is, imagine there was some transitory problem, maybe talking to Entra, something on the Entra side. Well, my token will now be good for a much, much longer period. So I'm more resilient to those transitory type potential issues you could see. So that's one of the really nice things. Now, once again, if my client is not 401 capable, this will not be used. I will just get a regular 1 hour token to avoid the client getting into a position where, hey, I've fallen and I can't get up. There is another aspect as well. If I think about, hey, I get a token, Now imagine I talked about when I get the access token, it's checking my conditional access policies. Now let's imagine for a second what my conditional access policy, let's say I have conditional access policy number 1, that applies to whatever I'm doing right here. As part of that particular resource, I'm using a named IP location. So I'm using IP-based location. That can be IPv4 or IPv6. Now, when this happens, what it does is, for the access token it gives you, it also adds in the conditional access policy IDs where there is a location. So this access token it gave me for the resource, it also added to it the conditional access policy IDs. So they're added to it. It's just the IDs. And I think it's just actually CPID. So now the resource sees the access token with this list of conditional access policy IDs, and it goes and talks to this endpoint, and it's like, hey, I've got this list of conditional access policy IDs. What are the IP ranges for that? And the endpoint will send back the list of CIDR ranges that represent whatever that IP location policy is. So now the resource can do an additional check. Again, providing the client is CAE capable, the resource supports CAE, and there has been a conditional access policy that applies to this resource that is IP-based, not geo-based or anything else. It's only for the IP-based. Well, now the IDs of those conditional access policies get added to the token. The resource provider for that service now will go and ask the endpoint, well, what are the CIDR ranges for these IDs? And now it will check that a data plane, so the communication that's happening, are you within these list of IP addresses? So if I went and got the access token and then I took my laptop and I went somewhere else, well, now if I didn't meet this requirement, I don't have to wait an hour. It would be like, no, you're not in this IP location anymore. Here's the challenge. I want a token from these ranges. Likewise, if someone stole your access token, will they be from a different IP location? It wouldn't work. So it starts to give me some additional protection from, hey, if someone does steal my access token, and if I'm using those IP-based location policies, the person that stole your token is coming from a different place, it wouldn't work. So again, it just adds another aspect. So instead of just being these revocation events, it's now also checking, hey, where are you actually talking to me from? Because I know based on the token you were given, you were supposed to be coming from these CIDR ranges. And it's going to go and check that. There's a caveat here. One of the interesting things you will see, let's actually jump over super quickly. So if we jump back over and, oh, this is nice. Okay, so I should call attention to this. What's happened here? It's kicked in. I'm getting my 401, and it's telling me a claims challenge required exception was thrown. Now, the dumb little PowerShell script I wrote is not fully CAE capable. The Microsoft Graph PowerShell is, but the way I'm doing it, I'm kind of hacking a token. And so I don't respond correctly. And I don't respond correctly kind of on purpose because I want it to just keep showing the error. But we can see here that, hey, it was good, and then it just failed. And now it's basically complaining that I'm getting the 401. So at this point on, I would have to meet this challenge for it to actually function. So that's really one of the kind of the key things we have to be able to do. So it's nice when a demo works. But what I wanted to show you was, hey, let's go and look at our conditional access policies for a second. And I'll just pick any policy. It doesn't really matter. I'll just pick, sure. One of the things we have, if I look at my session controls, is we have an option to customize continuous access evaluation. So this was in the session controls. And I can say strictly enforce location policies. Now, ordinarily, if you have a stricter option around security, that is a no-brainer. It's like, yes, I want stricter policies. I'm going to turn that on. And then what happens is, in some companies, no one can access any of the services anymore. And it's like, what is going on? Some companies, imagine you have your corporate network or some IP set of ranges. And then remember again, we have Entra, and I have my client. And imagine now what I have is some firewalls. And I have some firewall that has certain public IPs. And I've configured things for various types of traffic to go via this. So for my authentication traffic, all of the authentication traffic should flow this way. So I've done a conditional access policy that's looking for these IPs are allowed to get the access tokens. Fantastic. I'm all good to go. And now, again, I'm trying to talk to my resource. This is Office. Well, Office is kind of chatty. There's a lot of traffic. So what I did is, rather than make all of that traffic go through maybe my very high quality TLS termination, inspecting all the traffic, here, I have a different service. So I have something for just general internet traffic. I have a different firewall. I have some different egress point that has a different set of public IPs. Maybe it varies a lot more. Well, my data plane for this service is going that way. So what's happened, remember, because I've enabled an IP-based location, my access token says these are conditional access policy IDs. The resource went and checked the CIDR ranges for it, and it's expecting to see these IPs. That's why I configured my conditional access policy for. Let's assume I didn't do them in here. These changed too much. Or, remember, it could absolutely be my client isn't even on my network. Maybe my client is at home, but they have some kind of VPN, so the auth traffic still flows this way. But then regular internet traffic, they don't at all. Regular internet traffic, they go that way. So this is all of the data plane type communications. Either way, the resource provider is seeing an IP that does not match what the conditional access policy ID is telling it should be. But remember, the conditional access policy ID is meeting the requirement when it's asking for the token, because the token request is coming via this path. So you basically have a split path scenario here. And Entra is smart enough to understand this is actually a very common configuration. A lot of companies have the authentication and critical flows going through one path, and then regular internet traffic, of which they consider Office, going a very different path. And so when they turn on this continuous access evaluation, it's going to fail. It's going to send the 401 for claims challenge. When Entra sees that, because the client is CA capable, sees, oh, I'm being challenged for the IP location, but the client's coming from the right IP, it realizes, oh, the client must have a split brain configuration. And they're not going to be able to get to the service. And so what it does is when it detects that, it uses now standard enforcement. It turns off the IP location. So when it sees that, oh, I'm getting this challenge, but the client is within the right IP addresses, its access token now that it sends does not have the conditional access policy IDs in for location anymore. So that's using a standard enforcement. Now, it's still CAE capable, but it will now be a 1 hour token and it's not location based. So that happens for us automatically. So Office continues functioning even if my company, and sometimes companies don't even realize they're doing that. If you do have this split path scenario, don't worry. Entra is smart enough to realize this must be what's happening. I'll give you a token without location. Unless, if I turn on strict enforcement, it's saying, no, the data path should always be within these same paths of the auth path. If it's different, do not turn off the location stuff, in which case now I can't get to it. So that strict enforcement, only turn it on if I'm absolutely confident I do not have this split path scenario for the authentication versus the data plane for the office traffic or graph or anything else. Because if you do, and you do have this split path, clients won't be able to get to the resource because they'll keep getting this challenge. They'll keep sending it. They'll keep sending back, you meet this, here's a new token. It'll have the conditional access policy IDs in it again. It will go and ask for the CIDR ranges. This is not the IP range that I'm expecting. I'm going to give you a 401. So that strict enforcement sounds fantastic. And if I know I do not have this scenario, if I know the traffic's going via all of the IPs I have in my IP location policy, great. You can turn on that strict enforcement. But if you don't and you turn it on, you're going to block the access. And then your users will be very sad. And then their sadness will be amplified in you and maybe your short-lived career. So we want to stay away from that. And that was it. So, I mean, really, conditional access evaluation, first and foremost, is a security feature. It's helping reduce the risk of that token theft. It helps reduce the risk of replay. It helps you be able to respond faster to those critical type user events. I can do the revocation. Now, obviously, I still want to use token binding where I can to reduce further the chance of the token theft. I would expect this to grow over time with more and more services. But it's a really great feature. Just be aware of not just turning on strict enforcement because you think it looks better. Make sure you're convinced you don't have this split path scenario. But we saw it in action. We saw I got that 401. I saw the claims challenge. So my client, and it's doing all of the checks for you. The client has to tell it it's CAE capable when it talks to Entra before it will go and use that. At time of recording, I can't insist that it uses CAE. Who knows what's coming in the future? But it's just a really nice capability, and that's what it's doing. It's always nice to understand these things. Until next video, take care.